This is the solution part of the workshop for video 4 in the debugging tools and techniques module. And so this model, or this workshop was called Broken Model. And so we provided a model that was broken and gave you the functional requirements. There's some basic functional requirements, and let you know that there were at least 12 issues with the model. So let's jump in and look at how we do this. So this is going to be a little bit difficult to simulate because I know what the problems are, but I'm going to try to walk through the steps that I would walk through if I didn't know what the problems were. So you're going to have to bear with me here a little bit. So I've got the model, and I'm just going to take a quick look at it. And so I look at the data, and I see that I have server and some processing times. I have a sequence table. I have a part mix table, which has my sequences for part B, part A, part B, and part C. So I'm using the sequence table. And when I look at my model, I'm creating the entity. I'm setting a table row reference to table 2. So I'm creating entities that are, based on this product mix, and so I'm assigning the sequence that way. Then the sequence is going to determine the sequence that the parts follow. I have my 2 workers here, and so I'm going to look at server 1 and sort of scroll down. It looks like we're using add-on process trigger there, and we use that triggers as secondary resource and add-on process triggers here. And looks like here we're using the processing times from table 1 in servers 5 and 6. And then when I look down here, I'm creating an entity also. I'm going to, they'll go to server 7. I have my vehicle here. It's going to transport. And so if I look at my output node, I'm going to transport on a vehicle. And my transfer node here, I'm an output on a vehicle. So that's sort of the basic structure of the model that I just sort of looked at. I hadn't run it yet. That's going to be the next step. But I just wanted to get a sense of the structure of the model before we did that. So let's go ahead and run the model. And we see pretty much an immediate error. Unable to evaluate status expression for graphic. Object model status label. So probably one of these two right here, because the object is the model and the status label. So I'm going to pause the simulation, and now we can see an error here. Also note if I just click on the trace window, then we can also see that error. So it looks like my error is right here in this status label. So I'm going to stop the model so that I can actually see it. And yeah, there's the problem. So the problem is I'm using the component of the population, but that you need an instance, not the entity type. So I need default, because remember we use the model entity object, and when we create default entity is an instance, and it's the instance that we use for the population functions and states. So that's one error that we saw. So let's just run a little bit longer, see what's going on. We are counting up here. Doesn't look like we're counting anything here. Looks like things are stacking up down here. So let me stop that and take a quick look. We have output at source 2, so we are requesting a vehicle. But if you look at our paths, we have unidirectional paths, and the vehicle home node is right here. And so the vehicle doesn't have any way to get to source 2. So I'm going to click on that one and make it bidirectional. And then we're going to have the same issue over here. Once it delivers the entity to sync 2, it's got to get back. So we want to make this one bidirectional also. So we have the 2 unidirectional paths. Let's run that now, and now we can immediately see that the entities are going back and forth. So I'm going to watch this for a little bit. Looks like something weird's going on here. We've got that kind of looping behavior. So take another quick look down here at the bottom part of the model, see if I can figure out what's going on. When I go to server 1, I then request the vehicle. So I've got this arc going out, and then I also have this arc going out in this direction. And so we got to figure out how the entity is choosing which one of these paths to take.
So if I look at the output, it's got the continue, and so we haven't set the destination to be sync2. So when the entity leaves here, it doesn't have directions of where it wants to go. So it's just going to use selection weights. That selection weight is 1. That selection weight is also 1. So equal probability go along those two paths. So what I'm going to do is jump into my add-on process triggers, and after processing, I'm going to set node. So now I'm going to set a specific destination, and that's going to be the input at sync2. And so now the entities have a specific destination to go, and so they should ignore those selection weights. So again, look down here, and now we should see when entities come out, the vehicle takes them back, and we don't ever see entities that get transported up and around that loop. And so that's the error that we had with that, is that we were using the by link weight when we wanted to use the destination. We had to set the destination. Okay, so continuing on, again, we'll just watch the model for a little while. This guy looks pretty good. Our number of entities looks pretty good. Going up into the model, let's see, coming out of server 1, server 2, we see our workers here. I'm not seeing anything leave server 4 or 5 and get to server 6 yet. Let's watch that just for a little while and see if we see anything here. None of these, this one hasn't left yet, so let's stop and go back and look and see what's going on here. So we're using table 1 processing time minutes, table 1 processing time minutes, table 1 processing time minutes. So we have a table 1. So let's go back to our data. Here is table 1. And so we're using the rows. And so our problem here is that we've specified processing time in minutes, but we haven't specified units. And so what happens is, since we haven't specified the units here, it's going to be interpreted in the base time units of hours. So what I want to do is go and say, I want to make this a time, and I want to specify that in minutes, so that when I go back here, the interpretation on this for this one is in minutes. And so now when we run, we should see things moving through, which of course they do on that one, but now we generated a new error. So the error that we see now basically says runtime was error, object is server, on entered processing, release secondary resource. So error, default entity releasing resource for worker 2 because the number of resource was only 0. So it looks like we're trying to release something as a secondary resource that hasn't been seized. So let's go back, take a look at what's going on here. So we have two add-on processes. We have a before processing and an after processing. So we're going to take a look at those. Here's the before processing, so we seize worker 2, and here's the after processing where we release worker 2. So we're using add-on processes, but our error was for a secondary resource. So we had a secondary resource, wherever that is, right here, releasing secondary resources. So let's go back and look at server 4, and down here we have other releasing resources. So we're trying to release a resource that we had already released with the add-on process. So let's get rid of that secondary resource. Let's make sure we're not doing that for server 5, which we're not. Make sure we're not doing it for server 6. Which we're not. We also don't seem to be seizing and releasing. So it doesn't look like we have seized and released for server 6. Was that part of the assignment? Let's see. No, only 4 and 5. So servers 1 through 3 need worker 1, and 4 and 5 need worker 2. So it's fine that server 6 doesn't have those. So while we're looking, let's see how we handle server 1, 1, 2, and 3. So we have a before 1 processing, but no after processing. Server 2 before process, again, no after processing. Server 3 process triggers. So we need to do the before processing so we can see server 1. So server 1 before processing. So now all 3 of these will grab it, but nowhere do we release it. So if we run the model, once an entity gets through server 6, we should actually see this. So let's watch and see what happens here.
Oops, there's a problem. The entity went from server 6 back. So that we saw an entity really quickly that went from server 6 to go back. So let's look at what's going on here. So again, these are routed by sequence, and we have the by sequence here. So let's go look at our data, go look at our table 2, and we see there's part A, and there's part B, and there's part C. And what's missing is when they get to input at server 6, we don't specify that they should go to the sink. So once they finish at server 6, they're done with the sequence. So we need to go back in and add input at sync 1 for part A, input at sync 1 for part B, and input at sync 1, sorry, for part C. So now we've expanded the sequence to include the sync. And we can go back and look for our original problem that we think is going to happen is that we haven't released any worker 1. And so that's in fact what we see. We're destroying entity with C's resources. And so that's, I'm just going to pause the simulation and go back here. And so what we need to do is add a after processing add-on here. So let's just double click there. And I'm going to release, and I'm going to release worker 1. So add specific release worker 1. And so that's the server 1 after processing. And we need to use that same add-on process for server 2 and server 3. So server 1 after processing, server 3, get down to the add-on process triggers, after processing, server 1 after processing. So now when the entity gets finished on server 1, 2, and 3, we should release that. Okay, so let's go and let's have a look. Looks like we did release it, so that all looks good. One problem that we see is whatever this is, we don't see anything going on, so let's just go take a quick look. We've got count group 1. So I'm going to go over here, and that's a model state. And so we are displaying that value. I'm just going to search for it. Control F, count group 1. So there's where we define it. If we double click here, we have an assignment where we have a new value, but we have the real value. We haven't specified the state variable name, so we need to change that. Count group 1. And so now when we go back to our model and run, we are now updating our count group 1. So we got that. That looks pretty good. Let's see if I'm missing anything else here. So let's just run for a little bit. What do we see here? Well, let's fast forward for a while. Okay, now we have an error here. Invalid value, -0.1 for delay time. So this is server 4, token 34. So let's go to server 4, and we have processing time in minutes from table 1. Processing time minutes. And so in the source, table 1, processing time minutes. Okay, so we have a normal distribution with a mean of 0.3, standard deviation of 0.1, and so the normal distribution has infinite tails, and so it looks like we ran to a point where we had a negative value. So we have a couple of options here. We could change the distribution so that it's not normal, or we could just have a bound. So I'm going to just use the bound version and say this is going to be math maximum. Is it max or maximum? Let's try max of, let's say 0.1 and random 0.3. And so this time if this draws negative, then we're going to have the maximum of 0.1. All right, so let's works if max is it, or is it maximum? Looks like max is working for us. So we'll just now go in fast forward mode for a little while longer, see if we see any problems. Okay, so we didn't see any more problems. So let me just stop here and take one more quick glance at the model. Okay, so this was weird. I knew there was one more error, but the solution I started with already had that error fixed. So we didn't get to see it in the beginning. Of course, you saw that when you did yours. So I'm just going to pretend like we're going to go back to the beginning. I'm not going to redo the whole video. I'm just going to show you this one error, and it'll be immediately obvious what's happening here. Probably already. And we've gotten this error here on server 4 processing time. To get the value or the property, row reference, repeat group table. And so we go back and look and we say, okay, well, it's referencing table 1, processing time, it's server 5 references table 1, server 6 references table 1. So all of those references look correct. And we go look at table 1 at server 4, server 5, server 6. So it should be referencing row 1, row 2, and row 3, but nowhere do we actually set the reference. And so we didn't, in server 4, we didn't set the reference, server 5, so it doesn't have a reference. And so when an entity comes and it's trying to look that up in the processing timetable, it can't in fact find it. And so what was fixed in my sample model when I first started, which shouldn't have been, is this auto set table row reference, because we have the server objects defined here, and if we choose this to be true, then we auto set a table row reference for these objects. And so that's in fact what we see. So when we run, when the entity goes to server 4, it knows to look in row 1. When it goes to server 5, it knows to look in row 2. When it goes to server 6, it knows to look in row 3 of that table. And so in the initial version, the one that you probably saw when you were working this, that problem would have come immediately because it's the very first time an entity went to server 4. Before we detected the error of the units for the time, you would have seen this, this error. So in summary, here were the issues that we found. That initial status label, we had the object name rather than the instance name. In the bottom, we needed bidirectional paths so that the vehicle could move back and forth. In the bottom, we needed to use the destination rather than link weight at server 7. Table 1, we had the units column in that it was clear that we wanted it to be in minutes, but we hadn't specified that, so it defaulted to hours. For server 3, we didn't process a trigger for C's. For S1 processes, we didn't have in the assign, we didn't have the state variable for the counter that we had the label for. For server 4, we released a resource not owned. Back to table 1, we didn't have the auto set table row reference, and so it would have failed immediately. Server 1 through 3 and 6, we forgot to use the by sequence. The sequence we forgot to end with a sync. Servers 1 through 3, we never released the worker 1. And finally, server 4 at one point returned a negative value because we were using a normal distribution. So that's just one example of debugging where we developed a model where we had errors that we knew and that you were going to look at those. And so that concludes this workshop solution video.